My own father was actually in Gdańsk, so it was a German-speaking area, so he actually learnt German. He was an engineer, but he actually then joined the sort of, not intelligence, but he was involved in engineering for devices used in armaments and things. The war started, and the Polish army was sort of overrun, or Poland was overrun. He managed to join the Polish section of the French army, and he was fighting in France. He was actually a machine gunner, had to retreat. My father was very humble and said he never heard the order to retreat, but in fact he got the Croix de Guerre, the French sort of military award for covering the retreat. When the Germans then came through, they found he still had a hand grenade on him, and one of the Germans was going to shoot him, but the other one said, "Oh, no, we'll take him prisoner of war." My dad always prayed for him, so his life was saved. But because he knew German, he eventually befriended one of the guards speaking German to him and managed to escape, and then went through France, Spain, Portugal, and then managed to land up in Glasgow. This was in 1942, and he joined, and he was actually teaching military things up in Glasgow before he then moved down to London, and where he then married my mother, who was, interesting, he was visiting a friend in hospital, and she was a nurse on that ward, and she'd learnt a bit of Polish because there were so many Polish patients, so they met that way. So it was love over somebody else's bed. They were both had, not fiery, both excitable, and so I was used to sort of disagreements they had, and they shouted at each other and whatever, but then it soon got over it. Yeah. I went to St Benedict's in Ealing, I suppose whether it was the influence of the monks or whatever, or I liked to be a priest. The cardinal then at the time insisted that I finish my A-levels, but my A-levels weren't all that good. But after a year I started having doubts, was it just a fantasy I had? And the director then said, okay, take some time out. And he said, if you want to come back, then you'll be more than welcome. I then met my wife, who was actually initially in our youth club, in the parish youth club, and I got married. So I wanted to do medicine. So my A-levels weren't good enough to get into medicine. So I thought, well, I'll work in a hospital laboratory, at least that's sort of using science. Got frustrated that I really wanted to do medicine, so used that to then get a first degree in physiology and use the degree then to get into medicine. I won the prizes each year and got first class honours, and won the prizes in the medical school as well. So I got a good degree. My wife just got made redundant, but she saw an advert in the student BMJ, British Medical Journal, to join the services. So I applied. I then joined as a medical student. They paid your fees and gave you a salary, but then you had to do 5 years return of service in the Navy. The first 2 years you had to do general duties, and the three options were Surface Fleet, Royal Marines or submarines. Well, there was no way I was going to be a Royal Marine, because you had to be really fit for that. Because I was now married by this stage, somebody said, don't go to the Surface Fleet because you'll be put on a boat in Portsmouth and you'll be running in and out of Plymouth or do the 6-month Gulf Patrol. Whereas the submarines, this was the nuclear deterrent, Clara submarines, you're 3 months on crew, 3 months off crew. So it's a much more reasonable. Plus you get extra pay of submarine pay. So I opted for submarines, which was interesting. I had to do a 5 months nuclear physics course. So, because we were responsible for the radiation health physics, we were responsible for the atmosphere control. I became also the entertainments officer while we were at sea. An enjoyable experience. It's interesting, we always went out with a hunter-killer submarine who would be deliberately making noise. And at some stage we would break away. Obviously we were given depth separation so that, and we were very proud that we never got tracked. We always managed to get away, and the other Russian subs was tracking the hunter-killer making the noise. I left the Navy, they called me back again to do a hunter-killer patrol into sort of, we called it sneaky, where we went to look for up into the Arctic. So it was two ways, this sort of espionage and counter-espionage. I was interested in pathology. I was drafted in to help with Manchester air disaster, so I helped identify the bodies that sadly got burnt. And I also went over to Zeebrugge when the Herald of Free Enterprise, that ferry that left with its bow doors open, so I was involved in that. I became more interested in general pathology with a specialty maybe in urological disease, particularly prostate cancer. So that was my main specialty. I joke and said I had my teenage rebellion against religion in my 20s. So after I left the seminary, there was a time where I stopped going and I disagreed with the church on a whole lot of things. But gradually I came back and went on a pilgrimage to Rome with the parish. And somebody said to me, "Oh, you ought to be a permanent deacon." The new parish priest was the chaplain to the Guild of Catholic Doctors, which I was a member of. So he said, have you thought of the permanent diaconate? And that's how I got introduced to that and became a permanent deacon, still working as a doctor. Because initially I dismissed the idea and thought, I'm a heavy, busy consultant. When have I got the time to do the extra study and whatever? So the vocation director sent me off and talked to things. Get a spiritual director to advise you. So I said, well, I'm supposed to determine whether I've got a calling to the permanent diaconate. How will I know? And this wise spiritual director said to me, doors will open. If God wants you to be a deacon, doors will open. And 6 months later, a student that I'd had earlier, who's now gone to America to increase her with this top guy in America for prostate cancer, and he asked her to set up a private lab, which she did. And then she got pregnant and asked, could I cover maternity leave? I said, I can't give up an NHS job for maternity leave. He said, no, we'd like you to work with us because we're now expanding, but we only need you half-time, but we'll give you a full-time salary. And the spiritual director said, do you think that's doors opening? So now I've got half-time, so that's how that came about. But it was mainly taking communion to the housebound and visiting the local people's home and that sort of work. Yeah, so it was the service side, the diaconate side service. Yeah. After my wife died, suddenly it was unexpected. 3 weeks short of our 40th wedding anniversary, people said, oh, you can be a priest now. I said, no, I'm a permanent deacon. I'll never be a priest. And then my spiritual director invited me, would you like to be deacon it was a mass in the cathedral, the anniversary of the beatification of, in fact, this was an Opus Dei thing. I said, yeah, I'll do that. And it was during that mass, I'd finished my communion, was back at my seat, and I got this wonderful sensation of peace, tranquility, and even the presence of my wife Maureen. I thought, oh, that's so nice. Then suddenly I heard a voice saying, but you're being called to the priesthood. Oh, I didn't expect that. So obviously I spoke to the cardinal, then I was advised to go off for another lengthy retreat to discern. But yes, so God had to kick me quite hard there because I was refusing initially. And here I am, being celibate and being totally be able to give you around to the church, I think is right. But my background, both in marriage and in medicine, have been actually quite helpful. People have come to me with some marital things and they think, what does the priest know? And I said, well, I've been married for 40 years. And suddenly they think, oh, okay. In the families, people have died and going to inquests. And I've been able to support them in that process because I know the workings of the coroner system inside out, having been involved myself. So then somebody said to me, yeah, but you've lived a normal life. That's where you know what the reality is. Where sometimes priests sort of leave things to others to do, where I sometimes fight a corner. It's interesting, a lot of the vocations coming forward now are not straight from school. And I think that's valuable experience that people have worked in the real world, looked after their own finances and things before becoming a priest. So I think that's a good move at the moment at the church, or that's just happening. But there was one job I applied for, this is in my training, which I didn't get, which everybody was saying I should get. But then the consultant came to me and said, do you know why you didn't get that job? I said, no. Your views against abortion were known, even though the job had nothing to do with abortions. So, yeah, if you stand up your ground, then people do discriminate against you. I got involved in the Guild of Catholic Doctors, and I was the secretary of the organisation. They've now changed the name to the Catholic Medical Association, and then I was we then called it president and chairman for another 6 years. At the time of the IVF debates and the embryology bill, and they put my name forward, and next minute I was told, oh, you've got a knight of St. Gregory. So the bishop presented that to me in my parish church. There's plenty to do. In fact, I've joked with the cardinal and said, why did you give me 2 churches? Is that for punishment for all I've done wrong? One of my parishioners is a local councillor, and she was elected to be the Lord Mayor of Westminster, and she invited me to be her chaplain. Well, I've discovered that the Lord Mayor of Westminster has a particular historic role with Westminster Abbey, and as part of her, let's call it installation, there's a service in the Abbey, and I was asked to go there and actually preach in Westminster Abbey. Part of me thought, I ought to say to them, this is our church, we want it back. Obviously, I thought better of it. But it's nice actually preaching in the Abbey. I'm quite ecumenical, and for instance, on Good Fridays, we have an ecumenical service in the market just outside the church here. So we all come together, the Best Baptist, Methodist, Church of England. I think we ought to work together where we can work together. In fact, only last month I was given the 25-year scroll for being a member of the Catenians. And obviously initially I just was an ordinary layman, then as a permanent deacon. The rules were that if you were a priest, you couldn't be a deacon because it's a lay organisation. But then they changed the rules, and I was the first man to be ordained to the priesthood that allowed me to retain my membership of the Catenians. I was going to say, when I first joined the Catenians, there was a few members who were really sticklers for process, you know, and you had to stand up to say brother and all this, and really sort of strict committee members. And I thought, oh God, what have I joined? But then I enjoyed, obviously, the social side of things. The ladies' night, I think they come into our meeting, but our meetings are just prayers, so I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not anti it, let's put it this way. I haven't got any fighting that they must become members, but on the other hand, if they did, I wouldn't be upset.
Father Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's been quite a life.